acutely aware of time all of a sudden. I noticed a few moments ago I was sitting there and I looked down and my watch had stopped. And this morning I was speaking to Valerie, my wife. I was noticing that the days are numbered now for how long I get to listen to Christmas music without being self-conscious. For some people, Christmas music begins on November 1st, the day after Halloween. For some people, if you live in a house like I do where that's just way too soon, we have to wait until Thanksgiving Day or my birthday, whichever comes first. And since Thanksgiving rotates each year, sometimes my birthday comes first, sometimes Thanksgiving Day does. But then right about this time, I begin to count down how long it is that I am able to listen to Christmas music because I love it so much. How many of you have already stopped listening to Christmas music? By a show of hands. None of you. One of you. Okay, one of you. Some of you have already stopped listening to it. You were just not wanting to say it publicly. For others of you, you may even be proud that you've stopped listening to it. It's interesting, for many Episcopalians, many Catholics, they do not begin to listen to Christmas music intentionally in terms of something other than turning on the radio, but on Christmas Day is when they begin to listen to Christmas music. That's when they begin to decorate. And then on January 6th, with the beginning of Epiphany, that's when they will end their 12 days of Christmas. But we all have different, somewhat arbitrary ways of approaching this season. For several weeks, we looked at the arrival of God, and we wanted to focus on the arrival of God. And I can honestly say that this year, this season, I was more focused than I recall ever being in my life about the arrival of joy, about the arrival of hope, about the arrival of peace, and above all, the arrival of love. And then I anticipated, once again, the celebration of the birth of Jesus and what that means, both for us currently, what it meant historically. And so I would like for us to consider, now that this Christmas season tends to be winding down for many of us, at least it appears to be, what does it all mean for us? What does Christmas mean for us now, beyond the Christmas music, and some of it more powerful than others? And I enjoy all of it, the so-called secular Christmas music, as well as the hymns and the carols that were written that bring us closer to an appreciation of what it all means, what it means from the perspective of God, what it means both historically and what it means eternally. And if we want to understand what it means for us eternally and historically, it would be good for us to consider, and we're not going to elaborate on that this morning, but for us to consider the particular circumstances into which Jesus was born. What does it mean that Mary and Joseph had to flee from their place of origin in the moment? What did it mean that Jesus was born with a particular earthly identity? There is one who had a significant impact on those of us who have been fortunate enough to study theology. And theology is merely how we conceptualize, how we think about who God is, how we can begin to develop clarity about who God is, about who Jesus was, about this whole purpose for our being. And James Cone, who is considered by many the father of black liberation theology, said something that is hard for any of us to ignore. He's the one from whom I have paraphrased the statement that I often use: Jesus was who God is, and we are called to be. But James Cone was much more particular about that. He was much more particular in the sense that he pointed out that God has been actively liberating God's people from all that holds us in bondage since that original fall, however we want to understand that. That God has been active in our personal lives, in the lives of our families, in the lives of our local communities, and in the lives of people all over this earth. God has been active liberating God's people from personal, interpersonal, and collective bondage that we often refer to as sin. James Cone pointed out that God was active with the Israelites, liberating them from oppression, Egyptian bondage, under the oppression of a Pharaoh. He pointed out that Jesus was born with an identity of one who was oppressed. He was a poor minority who was suffering the oppression of a dominant culture, of a dominant military power. And so he More than recommended, he challenged us to consider who it is with whom we identify, that it is no accident, it is no coincidence. In fact, God was very deliberate. The time, the circumstances, the region, the context, the people that God chose to identify with, the one through whom he became embodied. So it's important for us to consider that. But that's more than we could consider in even a long-winded sermon that I often offer. But I do want us to reflect this morning on what Christmas means for us going forward. First of all, it means that there is always an opportunity for us for new beginnings. We saw in John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In the beginning was the Word. And then in verse 14, and the Word became flesh, and there was a new beginning for all of us. For each one of us, there is a new beginning the moment we become aware that the incarnate one is the one who was with God and the one who was God. And it's interesting in verse 2, it says, he was in the beginning with God. That word is more than a verbal word. That word is a person. And Jesus gives us an opportunity, a new beginning to see who God is. Goes on to say that in him was life. We have an opportunity during the Christmas season to grow in our awareness of what life really means. Jesus in John's Gospel goes on to say, I came that you would have life and have it more abundantly. And in him was the light. In him was the light. The light shines in the darkness, and as we say so often, the darkness did not overcome it. Christ, the light of the world, shines in the darkness, and the darkness will never, ever overcome the light. And in that light, we have an opportunity to see again just who God is, just who Jesus was, just who we are called to be. And then during the time of Christmas, we recognize that we have been given an extraordinary power. An extraordinary power. I come back, it was interesting, I was looking over various sermon titles since I've been here since October of 2015, and it really is difficult for me to believe that it has been my good privilege and grace to be a part of this community of faith for now over 4 years. But I was surveying some of the titles and some of the subjects that we've covered, and on a somewhat regular basis, that word power, the reality of power, comes up time and again, and oftentimes it is misunderstood. Sometimes we think of power in terms of military might. Sometimes we think of power in terms of money or resources. You've often heard the statement, I'm sure, that money is power or knowledge is power. And one person said it this way, that knowledge is money and money is power. We think of power in a number of different ways, but power really is neutral. It has no positive or negative value on its own. Power is simply the ability to achieve purpose. And because of Christmas, because of the birth of Jesus, we were given a power that was not otherwise available to us. That which was impossible was made possible through the birth of Jesus. And we say it in so many ways, and the way that I often say it is, as I've said already twice this morning, in Jesus, the Son of God, the revelation of God, the light of God, the full awareness of who God is. In Jesus, we are given the power that we would not have had to know who God is. In Jesus, we have the power to see who we are. And in so doing, we are given the power to become the people we were created to be. We were created in God's image. And through sin, and we understand that in many different ways, but through sin, our vision was distorted. Our conception was distorted. Our awareness of who we are was distorted. But through the birth of Jesus, we are made aware of who we are, of who we truly are, what our true nature truly is. We saw in our reading in verse 12 that all who received him, all who believe in his name, He gave the power to become children of God. Statements like that are at once powerful in a positive sense, and they can be powerful in a negative sense. I've heard this passage and others like it. Passages where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by me. And my concern with that kind of statement that is usually associated with an orthodoxy, and we should all want to have our own sense of an orthodox understanding. Orthodox simply means right teaching. But if we're not careful, right teaching sometimes gets reduced to right belief. And right belief can in turn be reduced to an intellectual assent to certain faith claims that we say we believe. And if that is all they are, then they lose their power. Because the power that God intends for us is to become children of God. Not merely have beliefs about God, not merely have beliefs about Jesus, and not merely to have beliefs about ourselves, but that we will actually become who we were created to be. To all who receive Jesus, who believe in his name, Mary and Joseph were instructed to name him Jesus, which in a passive sense means that in God is salvation. In an active sense, and I prefer it, it means that God saves. God is taking the initiative. And now we're getting to have a broader conception of what it means that God has been doing since the creation of this world, that God has been liberating us. God has been delivering us. God has been setting us free. God has been healing us. God has been seeking to transform us. Not just to solve that basic problem, as important as that problem is. Not just to save us from eternal damnation, as some would understand it. Not just to save us from eternal separation, but to save us not just from something we would rather avoid, but to save us for all that God desires for us. To save us for the restored relationship with God, restored relationship with those nearest to us, restored relationship with those in general proximity, our local communities, to restore us to be able to see that our lives really are interdependent, that what affects one directly affects all indirectly, that we have a sense of the community and the relationships that God desired for us to have. When we grow in our understanding of that child that was born 2,000 years ago and the purpose of that child, we recognize, and I was thinking about this as I articulated it at the early service, and I was thinking about it as I say it so often in this service, that what was revealed primarily and profoundly, simply and profoundly, in the all-encompassing way that God is love. I was thinking about those who have been called to verbalize, to witness, to testify as John was before he had a full grasp of who God is and who Jesus was. And I was thinking about throughout history, and I mean this, those recorded theologians, those who were the leaders in the sense of communicating who God is and what God's will for us. You can walk through history, and the most influential ones are the ones who come back to that fundamental and all-encompassing reality that God really is love. I think about the writer 1 John. Those who know love know God, for God is love. We see Jesus encountered Nicodemus, and the whole born-again experience is about being born of love. Those who have been born of love have been born of God, for God is love. Those first century, second century thinkers, now that Jesus had ascended and he didn't come back in the time that they thought he would come back, they come back to that fundamental reality that we are to grow in. God is love. Throughout the centuries, Julian of Norwich, if you would know his purpose was love. Why did he come? Love. For what reason? For love. It comes back to that time and again. The reformers wanted to make sure that we understood that salvation comes by grace alone and not by works. And when the church has lost its way, what brings us back time and time and time again is that central reality that God is love. One of the most influential theologians of the 20th century, Karl Barth, they ask him after all of his study, after all of his years, one of the most highly esteemed theologians, what is it you've learned after all of these years? And he said, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Simplicity on the other side of complexity. What has led to the liberation of enslaved peoples in this land was motivated, inspired, and empowered by love. Every advancement that has been made in any country has been inspired and empowered by love. Any advancement within our lives personally, within our families, within our communities, have always been inspired by love. Love, I know, seems so simple, and yet it is anything but simple. Let me ask you this. How many of you love God truly with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength? How many of you love God perfectly? Let me ask you this. Those who are nearest to you, do you love them perfectly? Do you love yourselves perfectly? Do we love our enemies perfectly? Perhaps the greatest sermon ever preached that's been recorded is recorded in the Gospel of St. Matthew, and you're familiar with it, but I'm going to read these words to you once again. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. It's love that is the power to make us the children of God that we were created to be. If you love those who love you, do not even tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Perfect in love. Perfect timing, sending his Son into the world. Perfect in grace. Perfect in forgiveness. Perfect in reconciling each and every one of God's children. I have a practice each year. As much as I love Christmas music, I also anticipate when I'm going to cut myself off from Christmas music until the following year. I used to have July. I used to wrestle and struggle for a Christmas in July, but we're no longer able to do that at our house. Valerie says no. So each year I have one last Christmas song that I'll listen to. And I've realized for the past couple of years this has been the song, and it's considered probably a so-called secular song. For some people it might be a little touchy-feely, kind of that kumbaya kind of feeling, particularly for those who would associate that kind of feeling with Yoko Ono and John Lennon. But it's a song that many of you are familiar with and you've heard. And it evokes both happy feelings, and yet there's a great challenge. So I'm going to leave this with us to be challenged in this time where we're transitioning from the celebration of the birth and what it means for us going forward, having recognized what it means to be children of God. So this is Christmas. And what have you done? Another year over, and a new one just begun. And so this is Christmas. Let's hope it's a good one, without any fear. And so this is Christmas, for weak and for strong, for rich and for poor ones. The world is so wrong. And so happy Christmas for black and for white, for yellow and red ones. Let's stop all the fight. A very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Let's hope it's a good one without any fear. And so this is Christmas. What have we done? Another year over, a new one just begun. Let's hope it's a good one without any fear. War is over if you want it. War is over now. My prayer for us is that we will take very seriously this season of Christmas, that we will look very closely at what it means that Jesus really is the Son of God, that we will take very seriously that we have been given the power to become children of God, that we've been given the power to be people of love, to be people of peace, to be people of forgiveness, to be people of grace. Amen. If there's anyone here this morning who's never made a confession of faith, a confession is just an acknowledgement of what actually is. Jesus really is the Son of God. God really is eternal and all-encompassing love. We invite you to make that statement. If there's someone who's not a member of a community of faith, this is an extraordinary community of faith where we are doing everything that we can to grow in that power as children of God, to love one another as God has loved us. And we all have an opportunity, and I invite you to stand as you're able and recommit our lives to becoming the children of God that God has empowered us and created us to be.